what we are showing is that if we were to deploy out to that level, then these are the implications. And we can show that deployments out to these different levels are practically possible. The question is really back to us and to government in terms of what is the scale of our ambition, and equally what is the scale of Europe's interest in purchasing electricity from us. So if I go to these key enablers, I'll just rattle them off now. We'll talk about them in more detail later on, but they are to be making the grid connections that will go out to the round 3 sites, if you like, super grid compliant, ensuring they've got the same voltages, that they can be plugged together, that they provide the building blocks for future interconnection to Europe. That we, on a similar note, take a leadership role in those European supergrid negotiations to ensure that we find ourselves at the, not at the wrong end of the pipe, if you like. And absolutely we have to be continuing support for the supply chain within the UK, and we'll need to be evaluating and where appropriate facilitating new financing structures to enable the speed and scale of finance required for this, I'll call it, emerging industry. So, Andy, I'm going to pass over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm going to run through it at quite a high level over the next 20, 30 minutes, some of the work we did behind this report. There'll be time for questions at the end, but I think we'll be only scratching the surface in terms of the level of detail that the team went into. So I think if we bear that in mind as we go, these are high-level summary messages, and there's a level of detail below this as well. So the first thing we looked at for this report is electricity demand in the future. That's important both for the UK perspective, how much offshore renewable power can the UK absorb in the future, but also we needed to know at a European level, we plan to look at exports to Europe, and we needed to know what the electricity demand will be across Europe. Taking some assumptions here around demand growth, underlying demand growth driven by GDP over time, a 10 to 30% reduction in demand due to energy efficiency out to 2050, electrification of transport and heat technologies to a level that's sufficient to meet our 2050 targets. And the implication for the power sector is around about a 3/4 decarbonisation by 2030 and nearly a full decarbonisation by 2050. And that suggests that we'll have a 75% increase in electricity demand by 2050 over today's levels. And we know that almost the entirety of that electricity demand will be for zero and very low carbon power. Similar picture plays out in Europe. So our first building block is there. We know there will be a big demand for low carbon power, both in the UK and abroad. Our next step was to say, what is the size of the resource around the UK? And we essentially went through a step process to get to this, starting off with the theoretical resource for each of our 5 technologies. How much power is there out there in the UK waters today? Then we said, of that power, what is technically available? What could be extracted using technology that either exists today or that we might believe would exist in 40 years' time? And then we constrained that number down further and said, of that technical resource, what is practical? And this is where we bring in things like shipping constraints, environmental areas, uses of the sea that potentially would prevent us from deploying the full resource. And then the very last step is to say, that's the practical resource, that's the maximum that we could develop, and then what of that is economic? And that requires us to make some cost assumptions, which I'll come on to, but also price assumptions. What do we think this electricity could be worth between now and 2050? So for fixed and floating offshore wind, we did a very detailed mapping of UK waters. For fixed offshore wind, you see these areas in green are the areas where there is space for additional fixed offshore wind capacity beyond rounds 1, 2, 3, and the Scottish exclusivity agreements. And you'll see this is apart from one relatively large area around the Dogger Bank, this is quite spread out around the coast of Scotland, around the Orkney and Shetland Islands, down the west coast, off the coast of North Wales, and also across the southern coast of England. The floating resource is significantly larger. You can just see that by the amount of green that's on this map. Worth saying for floating, we looked at anything deeper than 60 metres. There are technologies being tested today which are applicable for water depths of 100 metres or more. But in discussions with various people developing new technologies, we felt that actually in the future there would be a continuous range between fixed and floating offshore wind, such that there would be no water depth where you couldn't deploy one or the other technology. And on floating, essentially what you see is three large pools of resource around the UK. We have one to the north of Dogger Bank, off the northeast coast of England, one area of resource off the north of Scotland, and one area of resource off the southwest coast of Cornwall. The lighter green shading here that you can see at the top, down the side, and at the very bottom of the map, those are areas that are more than 100 nautical miles offshore of the UK mainland. There's nothing magical about the 100 nautical mile limit, but we felt it was important to recognise that some of these sites are significantly further offshore than people are contemplating building today, and that brings an additional level of challenge in terms of getting access to the site, the weather conditions that you might find on those sites, and as a result, the cost of developing and maintaining these sites. For the wave resource, we started with the theoretical resource, and we looked at 1,000 kilometres of incoming wavefront off the western coast of the UK, with an average power of around 40 kilowatts per metre. That suggests there's a resource of around 350 terawatt hours. We then applied conversion efficiencies. Now, worth saying these are our best estimates in the amount of time that we had to do this report. Happy to be challenged by future technologies, and hopefully this number can increase. But based on our best estimates, we think conversion efficiencies will bring down the theoretical resource to a technical number that's around about 100 terawatt hours. And then we reduce that number further to get to a practical resource by bringing in practical constraints. Again, shipping, it would be unrealistic to have a continuous barrier of 1,000 kilometres of wave devices. Similarly, there are constraints as you come in closer to shore for some of the close-to-shore devices. And we also brought in estimates of frequency losses. And that takes us to a total estimate of around 40 terawatt hours of practical resource for wave. For tidal stream, through the research we did, it's clear that there are four main different ways of analysing the tidal stream resource. There's a shallow wave method, a bottom friction method, the so-called farm method, and a kinetic energy flux method. We looked at all of these and we chose the farm method because that fits closest with the approach that we've used with the other technologies. That gives us a different number, in this case quite significantly different to some of the other published reports. But we felt, for us, in the amount of time we had, it was the right way to go. To get down to practical resource, we took into account water depth, 20 to 60 metres deep, flow speed of above 1.5 metres per second, power density assumptions, taking into account array and wake effects, and then also practical constraints around shipping and other uses of the sea. And that gave us a total resource size of just over 100 terawatt hours per tidal stream. I won't describe the tidal range numbers because I think of all the numbers, those were the ones we felt the most comfortable with. There's been a lot of research into tidal range. And I think we relied heavily on people's estimates of very site-specific numbers. So putting all these numbers side by side, what we come up with is a total practical resource of just over 2,000 terawatt hours. And just to put that in context, that's 6 times our current UK electricity demand. Fixed wind gives us 400